The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today I have Walter Block, professor of economics at Loyola University. Professor Block, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
What is a priori knowledge?
You're a nasty person, starting off with rough questions. No, I'm just kidding. A priori knowledge is something that is necessarily true. For example, all bachelors are unmarried men is necessarily true. It's a priori. People say it's just a tautology in the sense that it doesn't tell us anything about the real world. And usually you contrast this with stuff that is a posteriori, not a priori, namely stuff about the world. Like you have a very dark blue shirt. I have a light blue shirt. It's raining outside. It's now 5 o'clock Central Time. These are all statements about reality, but they're not necessarily true. I could be lying about the color of your shirt or mistaken or whatever. Whereas bachelors or unmarried men is, it doesn't have much to do with the real world, just how we use words. So the big Austrian criticism, or the big Austrian contribution, I should say, is there such a thing as a synthetic a priori, namely a statement or a bunch of statements that are necessarily apodictically true and yet have something to do with the real world? And only Austrians believe that, whereas the logical positivists, of which virtually all mainstream economists adhere to, would say, no, there's no such thing. I mean, if you're going to have an empirical statement, something about the real world, well, you have to test it. You have to see if it's true, and it may be true, and maybe it's true some of the time and not always. But we Austrians are sometimes dismissed as a cult because we believe that there are some statements, not every statement, but many statements that are necessarily true and apply to the world. For example, when you bought that shirt for 20 bucks, you valued that shirt at more than 20 bucks at the time you bought it. So you gained ex ante. And the guy who sold you that shirt valued it at less than 20 bucks. Maybe he valued it at 15 and you valued it at 30. So you made a $10 profit and he made a $5 profit. But we know that ex ante, you both made a profit. Otherwise, why would you have done it? Now, ex post, you might regret buying the shirt, or he might say, oh, I wish I had that shirt back. I could sell it for more now. But, so we can say as an empirical generalization that all trade makes both parties better off ex post. But there are exceptions. But usually, you buy a newspaper. Do you regret buying the newspaper because it was no good news or something? No, yeah, it's par for the course. Although sometimes you could say, boy, I wish I didn't buy this newspaper. But you can't say, well, when I bought the newspaper, I valued it at more than $1. No, I didn't value it at more than $1, and it cost me $1. You had to value it at more than $1. You necessarily had to, because all of human action is an attempt to substitute a lesser valued future for a greater valued future. And you thought that you'd be better off buying the newspaper at the time you bought it. So you gain the difference to you between having and not having the newspaper and having the dollar.
Now, Samuel Konkin took this idea of trade that we have, people have different values, and so they trade. If everyone had the same values, they wouldn't trade. So he said that this is the weak point in Marxism and socialism, because people voluntarily trade to seek their subjective ends, and anytime someone stops them from making voluntary contracts or says there is an objective value that we can find in labor, that you necessarily destroy wealth. Do you think this is why there's so much overlap between Austrian economists and libertarians?
Well, that's one reason, but let me just correct one thing where I think maybe I misheard, and maybe Konkin is wrong, and he said if we all had the same taste, there'd be no trade.
I believe that was his point in the section titled "Value in an Agorist Primer."
I don't think that's right. Not only if we all had the same taste, but I would say even if we had the same skills and the same taste, we'd still trade. Why, you might ask? Because, look, we're both equally good at fishing, you and I. And we're both equally good at hunting, you and I. And we're, what is it, Friday and Robinson Crusoe on the same island?
Yeah.
And however, if you specialize in fishing, you're going to get better at fishing. And if I specialize in hunting, I'm going to get better at hunting. So together we can produce more if we specialize. So even though we might have the same taste, half fish and half meat, that's our plus vegetables or whatever. Our mother said you have to have your vegetables. So, we'll have vegetables. But in terms of non-vegetable stuff, we each want half fish and half meat. So we have the same taste. And we each have the exact same skills in terms of fishing and hunting. However, if you specialize in fishing, you'll get better at it eventually. And if I specialize in hunting, I'll get better at it. So if we each specialize, we'll have more of both. Right?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think his point is just to make sure I'm honoring him properly here. He said the second two people engage in an exchange, the only way this is possible is if two people value things differently. Because if we both valued the thing the same, well, why would you spend the opportunity cost of the couple minutes trading?
Oh, there I agree with you. And I even said that in terms of your shirt.
Yes. Okay.
Or the newspaper. So I agree with that statement, but I don't agree with the other statement. I mean, there are two different statements on the table, so to speak.
Yes.
And I certainly agree with what you just said, but I don't agree with, and I think Murray Rothbard got that wrong, or somebody got that wrong, other than Sam Konkin. And I wrote a paper on that. I think it was, I wrote so many papers, I can't remember every one, but I think it was co-authored with Peter Klein and some student at the time. And if you want, I can dig it out and send it to you. And the idea was, even if we have the same exact taste and the same exact skills, it still pays to specialize and have division of labor, because we'll get better at whatever it is that we're focusing on, assuming.
So why should someone take the Austrian approach to, say, let's just say monopolies or the minimum wage or protectionism, any example you want to use? Why should we take the Austrian route as opposed to the what do the experts say and let's read the peer-reviewed studies to come to a conclusion?
Well, before I get to that, you asked me why is there is this overlap between Austrianism and libertarianism? So let's do that one first, since you asked that first.
Thank you.
And then we'll get to the other. Well, first of all, not all libertarians are Austrians, because in order to be an Austrian, you have to be an economist.
Mm-hmm.
Is Austrianism is a what do you call a phase of economics, or a branch? Well, not a branch or a phase. What's the word I'm looking for? A viewpoint in economics. And if you're a psychologist or a plumber or a lawyer or a physicist and you're not an economist, well, then you can't be an Austrian, because Austrian is part of economics and you're not part of economics. So then the question is, why are virtually all Austrians libertarians? Right? And as it happens nowadays, I don't know of any Austrian who's not a libertarian. However, in the past, when Austrian first started in 1870 with Menger, or 1878, I forget when he started it, but he was our founder. Well, during the Nazi period, there were Austrian economists who were Nazis, right? I mean, the Germans and the Austrians had economists, and some of them were Nazis. And, they were probably pretty good economists, but, Nazism is a little weak on libertarianism. But nowadays, I don't know of any counter examples. Every Austrian economist I know is also libertarian. Now, they might not all be anarcho-capitalists, but they're all libertarians. Why is this? Well, it's probably Murray Rothbard's fault. because he wielded a magnificent, important influence on the whole group. And he was obviously a libertarian and an Austrian economist. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is, for Austrian economists, there's no such thing as market failure. And here we get into your other question about the monopoly and public goods and externalities and all these market failures. Well, if you don't believe in market failures, this inclines you toward the market. Whereas the mainstream economists, who might be good economists, say on the minimum wage law and free trade, they all adhere to the market failure, and the big three are monopoly, externalities, and public goods. So that might be another reason why there's this overlap or high correlation between Austrian economists. I would say 100% correlation. There are no exceptions that I know of, but there could be. I mean, you could be an Austrian economist and favor the minimum wage if you're a bad guy because you hate workers. And I mean, it's a coherent position.
Yeah.
Look, I'm an Austrian economist and I hate unskilled workers. So
Yeah.
we've got to have a real high minimum wage. Now, my economics is impeccable. I know that if you have a high minimum wage, all unskilled people will not be able to get a job. And I hate them and I don't want them to work because they'll have a miserable life. Perfectly coherent position. I mean, I don't take that position, but I mean, I could, and then I'd be a good economist and not a libertarian. Because, you're not supposed to, as a libertarian, you're not supposed to forcibly unemploy people. So,
Yeah, I can't. One of the most recent, anti-free market articles out of the New York Times was about how this woman came up with a theory of monopsony, and this refuted a major myth of the free market, that perfect competition exists. So what they do is they create the straw man that we believe in, perfect humans and perfect organizations. So if they can point to any imperfection, they could use that as a justification for the state. But all the Austrian does is take those shortcomings and apply them to the state, and you realize that they're the same fallible humans, except the state, you can't opt out of funding. So you just basically come to the privatize everything conclusion. Why do you think there's that blatant double standard amongst the wisest people on the planet, that some people are imperfect, therefore the state has the right to violently dominate the entire economy?
Yeah, well, when I first started, that was the dominant syllogism. We want perfection. Markets are imperfect because they're populated by people, and therefore we need government.
Yeah.
Now, one of the benefits of the public choice school and Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock was they inverted that. They said, yes, we want perfection. Government is imperfect, therefore we want the market. Magnificent. I just love that. So what you're really asking now is, why do so many intelligent people, Nobel Prize winners in economics, favoring the minimum wage law, and not because they want unemployment for unskilled workers? Why? Or let me put it another way. We've got brilliant proponents of free markets and economic freedom. I mean, Ayn Rand was magnificent with her books, Ron Paul, Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises. And yet, Ron Paul runs for office and he gets the usual 1% when he runs on the Libertarian Party ticket. And, Joe Jorgensen and Gary Johnson, the last two LP candidates, they got the usual, Gary got 3%, which was unprecedented, but Joe got back to our usual 1.5% or 0.75%. Why, given that our views are so correct, why are so few people convinced by it? And I did write an article on that, and the article talks about sociobiology, and sociobiology is the theory of why we are the way we are, and the answer is because of what it took to leave people in the next generation, or our genetic code to the next generation, 1,000,000 years ago when we were in the caves or the trees or wherever we were. For example, nowadays, nobody is afraid of bathtubs. You afraid of a bathtub? I'm not afraid of a bathtub. Whereas we're afraid of snakes. You see a snake crawling around and you're going to get a chair and bash it, or you're going to get a chair and stand up on it or something. I mean, you're going be a little upset if there's a big snake floating around. Why? Nowadays, bathtubs kill many more people than snakes. Milton Friedman was killed by a bathtub. He was taking a shower, he got in or out, and he tripped, and he hit his head on the side of the bathtub, and on the way to the hospital, he died tragically. A great loss for our movement. Nobody's afraid of a bathtub. Everybody's afraid of a snake, and nobody dies from from snakes nowadays, but a lot of people die from bathtubs. Why is it? Well, a million years ago, if you were afraid of a bathtub, that conveyed no advantage to you because there were no bathtubs. Whereas if you were afraid of snakes, that helped you leave children to the next generation because you were alive. Another example. More pertaining to the pointed issue. There are two tribes of people, our tribe and this other tribe, and we have the same opposable thumbs, the same musculature, the same brain power, we're all the same, except in our tribe, you get sick this week, I help you, next week I get sick, you help me, we survive. This other tribe doesn't have this benevolence gene or this benevolence hardwiring. You get sick there and I don't help you. Next week, I'm sick and you're not around to help me. That tribe perishes. So we're hardwired to be afraid of snakes, which is irrelevant to the point, just to illustrate sociobiology. And we're also hardwired toward benevolence and toward explicit cooperation. But we're not hardwired toward implicit cooperation. What's implicit cooperation? The free enterprise system, markets, helping each other, cooperating. Ultimately, 7 billion people can all cooperate. Greater cooperation than a basketball team or, I don't know, even an orchestra, 100-member orchestra playing 64th notes. That's impressive, but 7 billion people cooperating, that's, magnificent in terms of cooperation. But we're not hardwired for that. We're hardwired for explicit cooperation. If you got sick now, I would call somebody or I would be very upset. And, if you lived next door to me, I would, give you the Heimlich maneuver or whatever it is. And I'm sure vice versa. But I get students coming in every freshman students, and you mention price gouging, and they go, oh, that's horrible. And minimum wage, oh, that's great. And we have to have egalitarianism. Namely, thank God, they've got the hard wiring for benevolence, but only explicit benevolence, not implicit benevolence, the market. So I think that's one of the reasons we're doing very badly in converting the masses to the one true faith, namely freedom and free enterprise, economic freedom. I think that's a reasonable, good explanation of why. It's sort of like the rock of Sisyphus. You push it up, keeps coming down, you push it up, keeps coming down. Now, look, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Just because I think we're not going to succeed doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I can't think of anything better than to promote liberty. I mean, it's just a magnificent kind of a thing. Better than Mozart, and I'm a big Mozart fan. So I adhere to the pessimistic view, but I don't say people should drop out or, leave the libertarian movement. I try to encourage people to join it.
Excellent. Yeah, but price gouging is a great one where they think, I'm for cooperation, there should be laws against price gouging, when you are literally stopping people from making exchanges and stopping the incentive for people to bring scarce resources to where they're needed most. So that does give me some hope that can be pointed out to people, or that can be explained in great books like yours. I do want to get back to, let's take the minimum wage, for example. If you say, well, the minimum wage causes unemployment, the Austrian looks at a logical a priori approach. The empiricist will say, let's look at the minimum wage, where it's been raised in countries, and then what their unemployment rate has been after that. What are the shortcomings in the empirical approach that the Austrian approach does not have?
Well, it's actually not exactly that case, because Austrians also can do empirical work, but we interpret it very differently. We interpret it not as a test, but rather as an illustration. I mean, what was it? Card Kruger, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, one of them raised their minimum wage, and they couldn't find any unemployment effects there. Okay, so they failed to illustrate the apodictic necessarily true statement that when you raise minimum wage, or when you have a minimum wage, anyone below that level with their skills isn't going to get a job. So an Austrian can engage in empirical work, and sometimes the empirical work is a good illustration of the apodictic necessary truth, and sometimes it isn't. So they failed to illustrate it properly. In that case. But what the mainstream says, well, since we couldn't find it in this case, the theory is wrong. I mean, that's crazy. It's sort of like the Pythagorean theorem. We know that the squares of the sides equal the square of the hypotenuse, right? And now I'm going to go take a triangle. Here's a triangle. And I measure the thing and I take the square of each side, and guess what? It doesn't come out. Well, that just shows that my triangle is crappy. Right? I mean, we know that the Pythagorean theorem is true apodictically necessarily. We know that 2 + 2 is 4. And if somehow we try to illustrate this and it didn't work out, well, so much the worse for the illustration. So again, it's not that Austrians refuse to engage in empirical work. It's how we interpret it. We interpret it just as an illustration.
So if we look at something like, I guess the fact that there are no controlled experiments, no truly controlled experiments among humans. So I say, you know what, I hereby issue 1,000 regulations on Walter Block, and Walter, you need my permission before you can publish any more papers. And then we look at the amount of work that you've done between now and when the regulations expire in 2 years. Well, it's impossible to know what you would have done had I not imposed that regulation on you. So is it the fact that human beings are diverse and relatively spontaneous and have some sort of unpredictability and free will? Is that what gives the Austrian position its strength that the empirical approach doesn't have?
Well, you're right. I mean, the closest we've come to a controlled experiment is East Germany and West Germany and North and South Korea.
Yeah.
The Koreans and the Germans, East and West, North and South, had the same culture, the same history, the same literacy, the same everything. And it was just an accident of war that broke them up roughly halfway each. And the North Korea is economic basket case, and South Korea is doing very well. And East Germany was horrible, and people were trying to leave and go west, and they were risking their lives and sometimes getting shot. So you might say, well, here's a controlled experiment. This proves that free enterprise is right. But you can always say, well, look, the reason that East Germany didn't do too well is that the dictator of North Korea should have been in East Germany, and the dictator of East Germany should have been in North Korea. Then everything would have been fine. And I mean, how can we prove that that's not true? So these are good illustrations, but you don't want to just rely on an illustration. You want to say, look, the reason that the North Korean and East Germany were economic basket cases is. Now you go read Human Action and Man, Economy, and State, and you find the reason. And the reason was, very briefly, there were no prices, no free market prices. There were just arbitrary prices, and prices indicate scarcity. And you didn't know whether to build railroad tracks out of platinum or iron. And unless you knew that platinum was so much more valuable that you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't waste it on railroad tracks. You have to use it for more important things. But if you don't have the prices, then you don't know. So yes, illustrations are good, but you can only go so far with an illustration, because look at my counterexample. We should have switched dictators, which is a little silly, but how can we say them nay? How can we say, well, no, that's wrong? Well, I don't know. Maybe it is. I mean, well, I don't think it's right, because, as Mises has shown, that you have no economic rationality unless you have prices that indicate something real. And in the Soviet Union, like during the first 5-year plan, they adhered to their view of eschewing prices. Then, happily for them, they had the NEP, the New Economic Plan, where they now got prices, the Sears Roebuck catalog or Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Well, they might not have fit exactly what you needed in Russia, but at least it was coherent prices. So they did a little bit better.
Yeah, and also it gives our opposition, our well-meaning opposition, a little too much wiggle room, because they can always say, well, that was socialism then. We tried it and it didn't work. Just like, the light bulb was never invented until someone found a way to do it. So all we have to do with socialism, statism, fascism, and slavery is find a method that works. And then the word works turns out to be the most vague thing you could ever think of, because anything you could define work. Some people benefited. Well, what would have happened in the absence of that? So, yeah, those are all excellent. Could you please expand on the socialist calculation problem? So, for example, if you say, well, we can't have one central authority because they don't have the ability to determine trade-offs and opportunity costs, well, couldn't we just have local governments reporting to the states, reporting to the regional, and reporting to the central authority?
Well, we could, but one of the problems is if you screw up under the communist regime, you don't lose money. They just give you more taxes. Like take the socialist post office. They lose money hand over fist every year and they never go broke. So you don't have that market discipline. I wanted to mention my old high school buddy, Bernie Sanders, who is now busy promoting socialism all over the place. And what he means by socialism is Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark, the Scandinavian countries. Well, one of my books, what we did is we rated the economic freedom of all the countries in the world. And guess where the Scandinavian countries come out? They're in the top decile of free enterprise.
Yeah.
Bernie doesn't realize that what socialism is Cuba and Venezuela and North Korea. He thinks it's, the Scandinavian countries, which is highly problematic. But you're quite right that the central planning doesn't work because you don't have coherent prices and the prices don't reflect the reality. I mean, should you bore a tunnel through the mountain for the railroad or the highway, or should you go around it? Well, it depends on the interest rate. It depends upon the interest rate, because if you go straight through, it's going to cost a lot now, but it's going to save a lot of money later. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you go around, it'll be a lot cheaper, but more people will die and traffic will go circuitously. It'll take longer forever. Well, you need some sort of an interest rate to determine which way to go. And you can only get an interest rate that reflects time preferences in the market. Whereas how does the Central Planning Bureau know? And why would it help to have a sub-planning bureau and then a sub-planning bureau? They're still not going to get what an interest rate should be or what the price of platinum should be. Look, I devote a half hour to interviews like this. So we got 2 minutes.
Okay.
2 more minutes. So one more question or comment?
Yes. Final question. What is the most important implication of Mises's human action? The idea that humans act. Why is that important along with its implications?
Well, one crucially important aspect of it is that if you try to deny it, you can't. Because if you try to deny human action, you're engaging in human action. Mm-hmm. So you're sort of like stuck in it. I'm a mainstream economist and I deny that there's human action. What did I just do? My denial was human action. So it's sort of a synthetic a priori again. And Gary Becker and James Buchanan dismissed Austrianism as a cult, a religious fanatics, because we believe in synthetic a prioris, because we believe in necessary truths. And we're not basing them on empirical research. We're basing it on praxeology. Since I've got 1 more minute, let me just put in a brief. I'm a professor at Loyola University. I'm always looking for good students who are interested in Austro-Libertarianism. So if you're a high school student thinking of a college, come consider us. And if you're a university student and there are no professors there that profess anything like Austro-Libertarianism, please consider transferring. Well, look, I really enjoyed this, and maybe we'll do it again in a month or so. I really appreciated the quality of your questions and comments.
Thank you for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Block, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.